Imagine drowning in beauty. Not metaphorically, but literally. Picture yourself at an opulent Roman banquet, reclining on silk cushions, wine flowing like water, the air thick with perfume and laughter. Then, the ceiling opens. At first it's enchanting. Rose petals, thousands upon thousands of them, drifting down like pink snow. The guests around you laugh, reaching up to catch them, letting them settle in their hair, on their shoulders. But the petals don't stop. They keep coming, cascading, piling. What began as a shower becomes a flood. You try to stand, but your feet can't find purchase. The petals are up to your knees now. Your waist, your chest. You're swimming through flowers, gasping, your lungs burning as you inhale perfume instead of air. Above you, watching from a raised platform in golden silk robes and a jeweled tiara, a teenage emperor reclines with a cup of wine, utterly unmoved by the suffocating spectacle unfolding below. This wasn't fiction, or at least, according to ancient sources, it wasn't. This was the court of Elagabalus, a Roman emperor so bizarre, so excessive, so fundamentally disturbing that history itself seemed to want to forget him. When people talk about Rome's worst emperors, they mention Nero fiddling while Rome burned. They bring up Caligula making his horse a senator. They discuss Commodus fighting as a gladiator in the Colosseum. But there's another name that belongs on that list. A name that makes even Nero look restrained by comparison. His name was Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, but history remembers him as Elagabalus, and his 4-year reign was a carnival of sacrilege, depravity, and violence that would leave Rome reeling long after his brutal death. The year is 203 CE. In the Syrian city of Emesa, modern-day Homs, a child is born into a world of power and ritual. His birth name is Sextus Varius Avitus Bassianus, but that's not what he'll be remembered as. His family held hereditary control over one of the most important religious positions in the region. They were the high priests of Elagabal, the Syrian sun god, represented not by a statue or painting, but by an enormous black stone. Some historians believe this stone was actually a meteorite, a piece of the heavens fallen to earth, which made the cult's claims of divine origin all the more compelling to believers. The boy's mother, Julia Soaemias, was connected to Roman royalty through her aunt, Julia Domna, wife of Emperor Septimius Severus. This placed young Elagabalus at the outer edges of the most powerful dynasty in the known world. The Severan family dominated Rome's political landscape, but their grip on power was always precarious, always vulnerable to the next ambitious general or disgruntled soldier. From childhood, Elagabalus was trained in the elaborate rituals of his god. He learned the prayers, the sacrifices, the sacred dances performed in golden robes before the black stone. He was being prepared for a life of religious service. What no one could have predicted was that this teenage priest would soon become master of the greatest empire on earth. In April of 217 CE, everything changed. Emperor Caracalla, Elagabalus's distant cousin, was assassinated while stopping to urinate by the side of a Syrian road. The killer was a soldier named Justin Martialis, but behind him stood Marcus Opilius Macrinus, the Praetorian prefect who had orchestrated the murder to seize power for himself. Macrinus became emperor, but his legitimacy was fragile. He hadn't been born into the imperial family. He wasn't a senator or a general of renown. He was an administrator who had murdered his way to the throne, and everyone knew it. To eliminate potential threats,
Macrinus exiled Caracalla's female relatives, including Elagabalus's mother and grandmother, Julia Maesa, back to their estate in Emesa.
This was Macrinus's fatal mistake. Julia Maesa was not a woman who accepted exile quietly. She had tasted imperial power, had seen her sister become empress, and she wanted that power back. She was cunning, wealthy, and absolutely ruthless. Looking at her 14-year-old grandson, the beautiful boy who presided over rituals at the temple, she saw her path back to Rome. She began to spread a rumor, carefully, strategically. She whispered to soldiers, to merchants, to anyone who would listen, that Elagabalus wasn't actually the son of Sextus Varius Marcellus. No. He was the illegitimate son of the beloved Caracalla himself. "Look at him," she would say. "See the resemblance. This is Caracalla's blood." It was almost certainly a lie, but it was a lie that worked. The soldiers of the 3rd Legion Gallica, stationed near Emesa, were already angry with Macrinus. He had made an unpopular peace treaty with the Parthians, Rome's ancient enemy, and he had failed to pay the troops what they believed they were owed. When Julia Maesa presented them with this handsome young man who allegedly carried Caracalla's blood, who performed rituals with such dramatic flair in his silk robes and jewels, they saw an opportunity. On the night of May 15th, 218 CE, Elagabalus was smuggled into the legionary camp at Raphanea. At dawn, the soldiers proclaimed him emperor, giving him the name Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, the same imperial title Caracalla had used. Macrinus, learning of the rebellion, had no choice but to fight. The two forces met at the Battle of Antioch on June 8, 218 CE. Despite his youth and inexperience, Elagabalus allegedly led his troops from the front, a golden figure on horseback that seemed almost divine to his soldiers. Or perhaps it was just the General Gannus, his tutor, who actually commanded the troops while the boy emperor provided symbolic leadership. Either way, Macrinus was defeated. He fled, was captured, and executed. At 14 years old, Elagabalus had become Emperor of Rome. When he arrived in Rome in the summer or fall of 219 CE, the Senate was hopeful. They had endured the violent reign of Caracalla and the unstable usurpation of Macrinus. Perhaps this young emperor, guided by his wise grandmother, would bring stability. Those hopes died quickly. Elagabalus didn't come to Rome to play the role of traditional emperor. He came to transform the eternal city into a mirror of his Syrian homeland, and he didn't care who it offended. The first shock came when he brought his god to Rome. Not a priest of the god, not a delegation to build a temple. He brought the actual stone itself, that massive black meteorite that represented Elagabal, and installed it in a newly constructed temple on the Palatine Hill. He called the deity Deus Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun god, and declared that this Syrian deity would now sit above Jupiter himself as the supreme god of Rome. To Romans, this was unthinkable. Jupiter had been the king of their gods for centuries. The entire religious structure of the state, the very identity of what it meant to be Roman, was built around these traditional deities. Elagabalus didn't care. He forced senators, those dignified men who represented Rome's most ancient families, to participate in his religious ceremonies.
These proud Romans had to dress in Syrian priestly robes, carry golden vessels filled with the blood and entrails of sacrificed animals, and dance in processions around the black stone, while the teenage emperor, in silk and jewels, presided over the rituals.
But the religious controversy was only the beginning. Elagabalus's personal life became the subject of endless scandal. He married a Vestal Virgin named Aquilia Severa, one of the priestesses sworn to lifelong chastity in service to the goddess Vesta. This wasn't just socially unacceptable, it was blasphemy of the highest order, a violation so profound that ancient Romans believed it could bring divine wrath upon the entire city. When challenged, Elagabalus justified his actions by claiming that the union between himself, a sun god's high priest, and a Vestal Virgin would produce godlike children. He married and divorced Aquilia twice, and married at least 3 other women in between, treating matrimony like a game he could start and stop at will. Then there were the men. Ancient sources, particularly the historians Cassius Dio and Herodian, describe Elagabalus's relationships with male lovers in lurid detail. There was Heracles, a chariot driver, a former slave with blonde hair, who allegedly became the emperor's husband. Elagabalus called him husband openly, staged fake scenes of adultery to be caught by him, and proudly displayed the black eyes he claimed to receive in their domestic disputes. When a handsome athlete named Zoticus arrived in Rome, famous for his exceptional physical endowments, Elagabalus made him court chamberlain and allegedly greeted him by saying, "Call me not lord, for I am a lady." According to Dio, Elagabalus would dress in women's clothing, wear makeup, and remove his body hair in the fashion of Roman women. Some modern scholars have suggested this might indicate that Elagabalus was transgender, though we must be careful about projecting modern concepts onto ancient behaviors. What disturbed Romans most wasn't just who the emperor slept with, it was that he elevated these lovers, often men of low birth or foreign origin, to powerful positions in government while treating the Senate with open contempt. He appointed his lovers as officials and advisors, men who had no training, no experience, no qualifications beyond the emperor's favor. The ancient aristocracy, families who had served Rome for generations, watched as their empire was handed over to the emperor's bedroom companions. Now let's return to those rose petals, to that horrific banquet that may or may not have actually happened. According to the Historia Augusta, a collection of imperial biographies written in the late Roman period, Elagabalus designed a dining room with a false ceiling. During a banquet, he had the ceiling opened, and flowers, violets and other blooms, according to the original text, came pouring down on his guests. So many flowers that some of the guests, unable to climb to the top of the rising tide of petals, suffocated to death while the emperor watched. The Victorian painter Lawrence Alma Tadema immortalized this scene in his 1888 masterpiece, The Roses of Heliogabalus, though he chose rose petals instead of violets, perhaps because roses better symbolized the decadence and corruption of the emperor's court. We need to be honest here. Did this actually happen? Probably not as described. The physics alone make it questionable. How many flower petals would you actually need to suffocate someone? How would you collect and store that many flowers? The Historia Augusta is notoriously unreliable, filled with exaggerations and outright fabrications. But whether this specific incident occurred or not, the story tells us something important. It tells us how Romans, even generations later, understood Elagabalus's reign as a time when beauty became deadly, when pleasure and violence merged into something grotesque, when the emperor treated human lives as props in his theatrical displays. And there were other displays.
He allegedly held naval battles not on water, but on wine, filling massive pools with expensive Falernian red to recreate Homer's wine-dark sea. He raced chariots pulled by camels and elephants through the streets of Rome, destroying tombs and monuments in his path. He gave bizarre gifts to his favorites, showering them with random objects in excessive quantities, setting a trend that would last for centuries in Rome. His banquets were legendary for their extravagance and cruelty. He would release lions and leopards, their teeth and claws removed to make them harmless, into dining halls and laugh at the terror of guests who didn't know the animals couldn't hurt them. He released actual venomous snakes into crowds during public games, causing panic and injury.
The financial cost of his reign was staggering. He spent more on food, clothing, and entertainment than any previous emperor. He wore nothing but Chinese silk, which had to be imported across thousands of miles at enormous expense. He would never wear the same pair of shoes twice. His meals included delicacies mixed with gold flakes and pearls. While Rome's treasury drained, while soldiers went unpaid, while the empire's borders faced constant threats, their teenage emperor played dress-up and hosted deadly parties. By 221 CE, everyone knew the situation was unsustainable. Julia Maesa, the grandmother who had put Elagabalus on the throne, could see the writing on the wall. The Praetorian Guard was angry. The Senate was furious. The common people, who had initially been entertained by the scandal, were growing restless. Maesa convinced Elagabalus to adopt his cousin, Alexander Severus, as his heir and give him the title of Caesar. Alexander was everything Elagabalus wasn't: serious, studious, respectful of tradition. The contrast made Alexander immediately popular with the troops in the Senate, which made Elagabalus increasingly paranoid. As Alexander's star rose, Elagabalus began to see his cousin as a threat rather than an heir. He started plotting Alexander's assassination, but every attempt was foiled, possibly by Julia Maesa herself, who had decided her younger grandson was a better bet for maintaining her family's power. On January 1st, 222 CE, tensions erupted when Elagabalus refused to accompany Alexander to the capital for religious ceremonies. The Praetorian Guard, already angry about unpaid wages and the emperor's bizarre behavior, demanded proof that Alexander was still alive. There were rumors that Elagabalus had already killed him. On March 11, 222 CE, Elagabalus brought Alexander to the Praetorian camp to prove his cousin lived. The guards welcomed Alexander with such warmth, such obvious preference, that Elagabalus snapped. He ordered the execution of the soldiers who had cheered most enthusiastically for his rival. It was the final mistake of his reign. The Praetorian Guard, the very men whose job was to protect the emperor, turned on him. They fell on Elagabalus and his mother Julia Soaemias, stabbing them to death. They beheaded both bodies, then dragged them through the streets of Rome as crowds jeered and threw filth. Finally, they dumped the corpses into the Tiber River, the traditional fate for criminals and traitors. The emperor, who had once reclined in golden silk, watching his guests suffocate beneath rose petals, ended his life as garbage floating in Rome's sewage-laden river. He was 18 years old. He had ruled for 4 years. The Senate immediately ordered a damnatio memoriae, an erasure from memory. His name was chiseled off monuments. His statues were torn down or recarved with his cousin's face. His religious reforms were reversed. The black stone of Elagabal was sent back to Syria. Women were again banned from attending Senate meetings, a privilege his grandmother and mother had enjoyed. It was as if Rome was trying to scrub those 4 years from history, to pretend they had never happened.
So why don't we hear more about Elagabalus? Why does Nero get more attention? Why is Caligula the go-to example of imperial madness? Part of it is the damnatio memoriae. The Romans were relatively successful in erasing him from public consciousness. Part of it is that his reign was so short. 4 years in an empire that lasted centuries doesn't leave as deep a mark as Nero's 14-year reign or Tiberius's 22 years. And part of it, honestly, is that his story is so extreme, so bizarre, that it's hard to know what's real and what's exaggeration. The sources we have about him, Cassius Dio, Herodian, and especially the Historia Augusta, were written by people who had reasons to make him look as bad as possible. They were justifying his assassination, explaining why such a dramatic violation of imperial authority had been necessary.
Modern historians debate how much of the scandal is true. Maybe he was just a teenage boy thrust into impossible power, manipulated by his ambitious mother and grandmother, trying to honor his religious heritage in a city that despised everything foreign. Maybe the stories about his gender presentation and sexual behavior were exaggerated to make him look weak and unmanly by Roman standards. Maybe his religious reforms weren't as radical as sources claim, but were simply part of Rome's ongoing evolution towards sun worship, which later emperors would embrace under the name Sol Invictus. But even if half the stories are false, even if the rose petals never fell and the wine-filled pools never existed, what remains is still extraordinary. Here was an emperor who fundamentally misunderstood or simply didn't care about the responsibilities of his position, who treated Rome's most sacred traditions as obstacles to his personal vision, who elevated pleasure and spectacle above governance and military leadership, who died at 18, murdered by his own guards, his body thrown away like trash, his memory deliberately destroyed. The reign of Elagabalus stands as a warning about what happens when power is given to someone completely unprepared for it, someone without the wisdom, maturity, or respect for tradition necessary to wield it responsibly. It's a story about the dangers of absolute power combined with youth and inexperience. It's about what happens when personal gratification becomes more important than public duty. And it's about how quickly an empire can unravel when its leader becomes more interested in shocking people than in leading them. If this story fascinated you, if it made you realize just how dark and strange Roman history really gets, then you need to subscribe to The Midnight Historian. We dig deep into history's darkest corners, the emperors everyone forgot, the events too disturbing for textbooks, the truths that got buried under centuries of silence. Hit that like button, drop a comment telling us which Roman emperor we should cover next, and subscribe so you never miss another journey into history's shadows. Because there are more stories like Elagabalus out there, more rulers whose reigns were so bizarre that history tried to forget them, and we're going to find every single one. The black stone of Elagabalus sits somewhere in Syria now, if it still exists. The temple Elagabalus built for it on the Palatine Hill is gone, its stones scattered and reused for other buildings over the centuries. The boy emperor himself is nothing but whispers in ancient texts, his real face lost to time, known only through hostile descriptions written by his enemies. But his story survived. Through all Rome's